Welcome to The Explainer. So, what if I told you that a handful of scattered trees in the Japanese countryside are actually living, breathing historical documents? Well, thanks to an amazing study, we're going to decode a story of ancient empires and modern economies, a story told entirely by trees.
So, where do we even begin? Well, our story starts with a puzzle that's been hiding in plain sight for centuries. It's one of those things that's so common, you'd probably walk right past it without a second thought. If you ever walk through the fields and forests of Japan's Ibaraki Prefecture, you'll see them. These single, isolated trees standing right on property lines. And for years, nobody really knew their full story. I mean, people knew they were markers, sure, but the history of why certain trees were in certain spots, well, that seemed to be lost to time. But that all changed with a 2022 study by Takuoka and his colleagues. They decided to tackle this puzzle head on, and their research, it's what lets us read this landscape like a giant open history book. It's really incredible. Okay, so how in the world did they crack this code? Well, they basically became historical detectives, using some really smart methods to unlock secrets buried deep in the past. They used this brilliant three-part approach. First, they dug into these centuries-old land records. Then, they took modern GPS data of the trees and layered it over detailed land use maps from the 1880s. And finally, and this is so important, they just talked to people. They interviewed elderly local farmers to capture the living memory of these traditions. Okay, so they've got their toolkit. And once they started putting the pieces together, the clues started forming this amazing botanical timeline written right onto the land itself. So what did all this detective work actually find?
What they found was just fascinating. It turns out different historical periods left behind their own unique signature of tree species. Each era had its own go-to marker, creating these distinct botanical footprints that you can still trace today. Get this, the most common boundary plant they found, a shrub called Deutzia crenata, also turned out to be the oldest. The study suggests its use as a marker could go all the way back to Japan's ancient Ritsuryo period. That's when the very first imperial systems for dividing land were created. I mean, just think about that for a second. These shrubs are living echoes of a practice from over 1,300 years ago. Wow.
And here's the bottom line. The choice of tree was totally practical. It just made sense. If you needed to mark the border of a huge communally owned forest, you'd plant something everyone could see from far away, right? Like a tall pine tree. But for marking the small line between your field and your neighbors, a little easy-to-manage shrub was perfect. And this is where the story really clicks into place. When they put the modern tree locations on those old 1880s maps, a really clear pattern emerged. The ancient shrub, Deutzia crenata, was almost always on land that was already farmland back then, but another tree, Portia villosa, mostly popped up in areas that used to be forests or grasslands. So, what gives? Why the difference? Well, this quote from the paper gives us the answer. It says the planting of this tree accelerated at the beginning of the modern period. This was Japan's Meiji Restoration, starting in 1868. It was a time of massive change when these huge communal forests were divided up and sold as private property. All of a sudden, people needed markers for thousands of new boundaries, and this tree became the go-to choice. But wait, the story gets even cooler. It turns out not every one of these boundary trees was actually planted to be a boundary tree. Some of them are just the lucky survivors of a completely different chapter of Japanese history. Yeah, the researchers found that some of these trees are actually living ghosts of old agricultural trends. They're leftovers from crops that were once planted everywhere you looked. So take the mulberry tree. In the early 20th century, Japan's silk industry was a global powerhouse. And to feed all those hungry silkworms, by the 1930s, farmers in this one region alone had planted over 27,000 hectares of mulberry fields. That is a ton of land. But after World War II, the silk industry pretty much collapsed. Those vast mulberry fields were ripped up and replaced with other crops. But you know which trees often survived? The ones that just happened to be growing on a property line. It was just easier to leave them there, and so they became these accidental, ready-made boundary markers. And that brings us right up to today, because this story isn't over, not by a long shot. The landscape is still being written, with new chapters being added all the time. So you have these newcomers, like Euonymus japanicus. Unlike the older trees, these guys showed no link to those 19th century maps at all. And the interviews with local farmers revealed why. They only got popular after World War II. They actually spread from people's garden hedges out into the fields. They're not a sign of ancient land division. They're a sign of modern gardening trends. And this all leads to the study's really powerful conclusion, summed up in this quote about chronologically dynamic anthropogenic legacies. Now that's a mouthful, but what it means is simple. The landscape isn't a static museum piece. It's a living mosaic, one that's been constantly reshaped by centuries of human decisions, from ancient laws to modern gardening fads. So, the next time you see a lone tree in a field, maybe pause for a second. It might not be just a tree. It could be a living artifact, a biological archive, telling this silent, incredible story of farming, forestry, and massive economic change. This research is just such a powerful reminder that history isn't only written in books, it's written in the very ground beneath our feet. And it leaves us with one final question to think about. What stories are hiding in the landscape right outside your own door?